I'm going to talk a little bit about this book before I actually begin reading it, because it is a complex book. It's a book that I think readers really have to put together. I intended that. I wanted to write a book that really made the reader engage the experience of reading. When I wrote this book, my structural challenge, if you will, was to write a book where a novel gets told in a minimum number of sentences. Instead of being like a Tolstoy who writes thousands of pages to tell a novel, I was curious to know what is the minimum number of sentences or words that could define a novel. I'm very interested in the ways that our lives are, on one hand, our lives. They're lives that are kind of bounded by our skins. We are these individual, autonomous human beings who go through our lives as individuals and often believe that we shape our own lives, that our lives are our own. The counterpart to that, of course, is that our lives are shaped by everybody around us, that the difference between our life and other people's lives, when you think about it, is very hard to define. And those two things, in a sense, formed the structural basis of this book, the challenge of knowing what a narrative is, what a story is, what a novel is, what a short story is, and where those two things, those forms link or bind together. And then the philosophical question about what a life is. How do you define a life? And they come together in the structure of this book, because what I set out to do originally was to write a book that was 12 chapters long and where the main character is only mentioned in 12 sentences, in a single sentence in each chapter. So that the chapters are really about other people whose lives touch and form and shape that main character's life, but she's only mentioned 12 times. And I was curious to know if you could actually form a novel that way. Could you get her entire life laid out through the lives of other people who touch her, who comment on her, a single sentence in each chapter? That structural challenge, I will tell you, is impossible. I couldn't do it. I ended up needing 15 chapters. I ended up needing way more than a single sentence in some of these chapters to get this done. But it does give you some sense of what I was thinking about when I began the book, some sense of the challenge I set for myself to drive myself through the novel. I do think that writers have to set challenges for themselves that will push them through or pull them through a work. So that's one thing I think to think about when you hear me read tonight, because you will hear Haley Joe Zimmerman, who is the main character of this book, mentioned in the chapter I'm going to read. And you will kind of hear, I think, how her life gets shaped by the lives of people around her, even though the chapter I'm reading will not be about her. The first chapter is about her. The others are not. They're other people whose lives touched her. Another thing I want you to know, because I think if you don't know this, the book doesn't make much sense. It began aesthetically when I came across a reference to pro-Ana websites, ANA, pro-ANA, with a capital A. A pro-Ana website are websites devoted to helping young women maintain anorexia as a lifestyle, to fight off the urges of their parents and their friends who are trying to get them to seek help, and to keep this anorexia. In other words, the phrasing is to keep your Ana, to keep your Ana. And Ana's capitalized, remember, in this. Ana has an almost godlike personified quality on some of these websites. When I heard about these websites, I was partially horrified, as I think people should be, and partially fascinated, and I experienced a very spooky response, and I mean spooky in the best sense. The sense of something larger than I am going on, something I do not understand, both within me and, of course, in the world. And as I thought about that response, things began to dawn on me. And one of those things that dawned on me was how familiar the language of these pro-ana websites is. Because I did go in and look at them. I had this sense there's something about this I need to know and think about and write about. The language of some of these websites is very religious. It's, you can hear it, It's very, almost the language of medieval saints, of much of the stuff that I grew up on in the pre-Vatican II Catholic Church. I don't know how many of you know the pre-Vatican II Catholic Church, but when I was a child, I was raised religiously on images of thinness, on images of asceticism, on images of martyrdom, on images of people who had such great faith that they resisted all of the urges of the world. They were willing to go into the lion's den, literally the lion's den, and be torn apart before they would give up their faith. I was raised on comic books that had a character named Chuck White in it, Chuck White was this good Catholic boy who succeeded in life in spite of all of his hardships by faith. I was raised in the lives of the saints. I was raised on images of crucifixes. The church I grew up in, I'd come in and there was this, in some ways beautiful, in some ways grotesque crucifix at the front of the church with Christ hanging out, his arms completely gaunt, his ribs showing, his stomach so caved in that as a child I didn't know whether to be horrified or drawn to that. And so when I read about these pro-ana websites, the language, the impetus resonated largely for me. It resonated in ways that I don't think I even understood myself. And I began to think that there's way more to anorexia than maybe even the psychologists understand, that there may be a deep spiritual longing behind it. And that, I suppose, is really the aesthetic power behind this book. As a fiction writer, what I do when I have large, unanswerable questions is that I write fiction about them. And I sustain those questions through the fiction. This novel begins then with a young woman named Haley Jo Zimmerman, who is a 20-some-year-old woman who lives in Twisted Tree, South Dakota, a fictional town. She moves to Rapid City to get out of that town, and she's anorexic for reasons that the novel eventually begins to reveal. She is tracked down by a serial killer who preys on young women through these websites. He pretends that he is another woman. He counsels these young women. He gives himself various names, Edwina, Mary, and develops what he calls avatars for himself, becomes another person, in other words. And when he has gained these young women's confidence, when he feels like he knows them so well that they're almost part of him, he then goes and finds them. And because he knows them so well, is able to control them, and he murders them. That's the beginning chapter. He comes to Rapid City, he finds Haley Jo Zimmerman, and he lures her into his car, and I don't show the murder, but that's the implication. It's pretty clear that she will be murdered. After that, the novel moves both forward and backward in time backward into all the places, all the points in various people's lives where they might have, or think they might have, bumped Haley Joe Zimmerman into a different direction. So the novel is partly about culpability, about, again, that shaping of other people's lives by our own. Is it possible that someone, sometime, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 7 years ago, might have touched Haley Joe Zimmerman in a way that would have moved her onto a different pathway? I think it's an unanswerable question, but the novel is raising it. So it goes back that way. It also goes forward from that moment into the trauma that this sort of event has on a small town. In a small town, and I think many of you are from small towns, trauma magnifies. It never rests in a single person or in a single family. It rolls out in waves, even to people who may not have had a lot to do with the person who was initially traumatized or the family. And so the novel is that exploration of what